Kiwanuka, and I'm not at home. I'm actually at TVO inside my boss's office. Stacy, thank you so much for letting me use your office. Usually we do these chats at home, but because it's the end of the season, there's a lot going on. It just felt right to do it here. But thanks so much for joining us. So, as you know, this month on the thread, we've been talking about public safety and bail reform. We looked at the justice system and the steps that federal and provincial governments are taking toward bail reform, the possibilities of rehabilitation, and whether there are better solutions to pursuing justice than in changing the way that bail is handled. Today, I'm very happy to be joined with Chris Sewrattan, a criminal lawyer and law professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. He'll be talking to us about his experiences and what he thinks of the current system and what, if anything, needs to change. But we also want to hear from you as always. If you have a question or comment, please enter it in the chat. And while you're at it, please subscribe to our YouTube and Instagram accounts. First, let's welcome Chris. Hi, Chris. Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
So very excited to talk to you, particularly today, because a huge story broke that you were involved with. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But I was hoping to maybe start with the basics, because I think when you talk about the criminal justice system, we've been doing this for a month. So many terms that I didn't know and how it all works. We know that the federal government, the provincial governments play different roles in our justice system. What's the responsibility of the federal government on criminal justice and that of the province?
The federal government's job is to set the law. It's like what you can and can't do. Because criminal law is a federal jurisdiction, the idea being that the criminal law should apply equally across Canada. And you can contrast that, for example, with the United States, where every state has its own set of criminal laws. The provincial government is tasked with enforcing the law that the federal government has set. So in Ontario, you have the provincial government, employing the police, creating courthouses, paying for a certain level of judges of the courts, hiring and training prosecutors.
And I'm also guessing it's different too for Indigenous communities, right? Because I think that's the federal government.
Right. So in the territories, the territory, which is, as you've said, a branch of the federal government would staff that. But in the vast majority of Canada, it's the provinces really who are in charge of enforcing criminal law.
And does the municipal government play any role at all?
In the criminal law, no.
Okay.
Just only to the extent that in big cities like Toronto, where the municipal government funds their police service, then they'll have some role. But in the majority of Canada, it's the OPP or the RCMP staffed by the provincial or federal government, as it may be.
Okay. There's a reason I'm asking that in particular, because there's been a lot of news. And I think even for us, we've been covering this for about a month. And there's a lot that I didn't know. From your perspective as somebody who works in the justice system, do you think that maybe the general public needs to get a better understanding, or maybe the general public lacks an understanding of how the whole system works?
The general public definitely lacks an understanding of how the criminal justice system works, but it's not the public's fault. It's the fault of the justice system for not educating about what it is exactly that it does.
Well, I'm glad that we get an opportunity to chat about this. And the reason why I'm pausing is because we are at work. People are in the hallway getting their lunch, and I'm having a little trouble hearing you, but we'll make it work. So we know there's been a lot of news and conversation around bail reform. Can you help us to understand how Ontario's plan for bail compliance fall in line with the federal government's Bill C-48 to amend the criminal code on bail?
Right. So start with the federal government, because again, they set what the law is and isn't. So the feds want to make it more difficult in certain circumstances for people to get bail. Namely, that if you're charged now with possessing a restricted or prohibited firearm, so like a gun, right? Like your typical handgun used in crimes. Now the accused person will have to prove why they should be released on bail. And that's different from the general rule, which is that the government, the Crown, has to prove why the accused person should be detained. And there's also a smaller one involving domestic violence allegations, where a person who's been found guilty of that in the past, but not convicted, because there's a difference, they now have to show why they should be released. The province now is trying to give more teeth to the existing bail laws. And so what they're doing is hiring a special team of prosecutors to come in to bail hearings involving guns and to vigorously oppose that person's release. They're also hiring additional police officers or staffing them additionally so that they can go, once a person has been granted bail, they can go check up on them to ensure that they are following their bail conditions.
Can you help us why now? Why the change now?
Well, it's not so much of a change as it is a ratcheting up of the existing process, at least for the provinces.
Mhm.
But to the extent there is any change, it's because of the news and popular opinion, right? Criminal law is an easy issue to find consensus on with the general public, and the direction is always to be more punitive.
Well, we know that part of the reason why the government introduced Bill C-48, they proposed these changes to the criminal code, was to promote community safety, which is something that I think all of us can get on side with, but also to reinforce, quote, public confidence in the administration of justice. And I guess that's an important part of this conversation is public confidence. The government, whether provincial or federal, needs the public to be on side for this.
Absolutely, they do. And it's actually written right into the bail law, right? There's 3 ways to detain a person and deny them bail. And one of them is, will the public lose confidence in the justice system if we release this person? So it's always top of mind.
Paulie, we use AI advisor on this show to give us some of the issues matter to Ontarians. Picked up that people are feeling a little more unsafe lately. As you mentioned, on the news, even on social media, there's a lot of conversation. People not feeling, but a lot of, if you TTC in Toronto, there's been a lot of violent acts happening on public transit. Is that what you're seeing in your law practice, bearing that out? Like, is crime on the rise, or is it just a perception that crime is on the rise?
Well, I don't actually know the precise statistics if crime is actually on the rise, but anecdotally, in terms of the people I represent who are charged with offenses, it's a mixed answer. No, crime is not on the rise, but yes, it would appear that there's an increase in young adults or youth being charged with violent type offenses, right? Your carjackings, your home invasions, things of that nature, the type of crimes that people buy alarm systems for, right? They strike to the very heart of what is a safe society.
In a recent Toronto Star article, you point to 2 incidences of crime that you say bail reform, quote, misses the mark. What did you mean by that? And what are they?
There were 2 instances that got the public riled up, and they both have very little to do with reforming the bail system. So the first one was the young 16-year-old boy who was murdered, I think outside of Keele Station or at Keele Station. And as immediately after initial, sentiments of grief from politicians, they began thumping on, we need to reform the bail system. Well, the guy that killed him wasn't on bail, right? So if we detained every person who was eligible for bail, that still wouldn't have prevented this tragedy. The other example was there was an OPP constable out east, Greg Pierce-Challa, who was murdered. Well, he was killed by a gentleman who was on bail for a previous allegation that he assaulted another police officer. And so it's, made good sense that the police would be upset that this person was on the street to go kill another police service member. The problem is, if the bail system was actually enforced the way it's supposed to operate, the accused person would have never been on the street. There was a warrant out for his arrest because he wasn't complying with his bail conditions. And for whatever reason, the police didn't go and pick him up on that warrant. And that's all law talk for. They could have found him and arrested him and put him back in jail. But he was released in September, and this tragedy happened in December. And there is still, to this day, no explanation for why he wasn't picked up and put into jail.
Chris, hold on that thought. I can't really hear you. Just give me a second. Chris, apologies, but I can't hear because there's so much happening out there. Apologies. I want to do a quick follow up with what you just said. I remember that story of that young man, Gabriel, who was at Kiel, and he's just waiting for the train. He's just trying to get home. And then his life, he ends up murdered in a place that we should all feel safe in. I'm getting the impression that has this conversation moved from a conversation truly about public safety and keeping people safe, and for people who are, have offended for their charter rights? Has this conversation moved from those two things to become sort of a wedge issue in your view?
I wouldn't even call it a wedge issue because again, I think there's so much consensus when a tragedy like that happens that the guy that did this should never have been on the street. And I think the politicians and the public alike don't care to discern whether we need to reform bail, whether we need to reform sentencing, whether we need to reform just the scope of criminal law to make more things criminal. People just want answers and solutions. Mm-hmm. Because you're not going to see any politician getting up and saying, well, we need to respect this guy's right to bail.
Right. We do have a question that came from before we started this conversation, but comments are coming in and we want to hear from everyone who's watching. If you've got a question for Chris, please let us know. This one is about GPS monitoring in Ontario, I guess, versus the idea of keeping someone in jail. This comment is from Alia Barnard on Instagram. So is GPS monitoring, is it a type of bail reform? What is the cost versus keeping an offender in jail? And is this even an alternative worth considering on this topic? Chris?
So 1 and 3 can be answered in the same breath. Mm-hmm. It's currently part of the law, right? So it's worth considering, and it's not bail reform because it already exists. Mm-hmm. In fact, the government, so the Ministry of the Solicitor General, has already paid. They will pay for ankle monitors in certain instances as part of bail. It costs approximately, it's a sliding scale depending on how much you make, but it costs around $600 a month to put an ankle monitor on someone and to actively monitor them. By contrast, it costs over $302 a day to keep a person in jail on bail while they're waiting for their trial. So it's significantly cheaper to have a person out on house arrest with an ankle monitor.
Well, you mentioned the 300 in that article that I quoted before that you wrote. You wrote that it costs approximately $302 per day to keep one person in jail in Ontario. If the cost of denying bail for a year was a person, it would be on the Sunshine List. And of course, the Sunshine List is a list of all public servants in this province that make over $100,000 a year. So the question to you, why should Ontarians care about the cost of bail reform?
Because you have to pay for it, right? It's not just a number out there, especially when you're concerned about, I think, you're concerned about crime on the TTC and you're paying an increasing fare for less service. And you're wondering, how can we solve this? Well, it's all from the same pocket. And if we were to not be so strict on bail, while in addition keeping people safe by putting accused persons on strict conditions, we could use some of that money to put back into our transit system.
Well, I know that's something for people who live in this province with the activity that you see on transit is that, it would help to make people feel safer. We do have another comment from RM, and they want to know, this is a question they want to know, why do criminals seemingly have more rights than the victims? Example, lawyers readily available for criminals, but not for victims. Support is lacking for victims.
I think it's a fair comment and an accurate observation. It's by design, right? It's a feature, not a flaw. The reason is—
Why do you say it's by design?
It's by design because when someone's charged with an offense, right, it's the state against them. It's their trial concerning their lives. And it's because of that that the Constitution gives them a number of rights. And you can only access those rights when you're charged. So it is tilted in their favor, because the idea is if they don't have these tools available to them, if we don't have a benevolent government, which we don't always have and will never always have, we can really crush the people, right? That's where you get totalitarianism. So now when things are not necessarily antagonistic, it feels like we're giving all these windfalls to the criminals and we're giving them all these rights. But the idea is we need them for when things get really bad. That's the whole nature of a right. The other half, though, is about what about the victims? Why don't they get that kind of funding? Also a fair question. And the fact goes to what we just talked about. It's all about coming from the same pool, right? The government needs to find ways to generate money to fund victims' rights.
Well, I want to come back to that in just a second, but I wanted to talk about bail reform for just a quick second again. Keenan Longan has a comment, and they want to know how this will affect the average everyday Canadian.
How bail reform will?
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to affect the average everyday Canadian. Bail reform is going to target a very small window of people, and it's just going to make it slightly harder for them to get bail, because the fact is, if you're charged with a gun offense, the odds are heavily stacked against you that you're going to get bail. If you're charged with domestic violence and you have a record for that already, really hard for you to get bail. And those are, again, features, not flaws, right? We shouldn't let those people out if they're an actual danger to society. So for the average Canadian, you're not doing those offenses, so you're going to be fine. And although they're pretty prevalent crimes, you're unlikely to be a victim of those crimes.
It's interesting what you just said, because depending on who you speak to, some people think that it's really hard to get bail, that the pieces already in place to keep people inside that need to be inside. And then some people are saying actually it needs to be harder. So what is the truth?
The truth is it comes down to an individual basis, right? So let's take an example of a carjacking, right? I think we can all agree that if someone is caught red-handed doing a carjacking, we want them not on the streets again, right? But then there's a whole other side to this that the public never sees, which is at the bail hearing, the person, let's say they're a youth, say they have two parents at home, and let's say they're willing to strap an ankle bracelet on this kid, and it's monitored by GPS, and they're not to leave the house at all, and the police are coming to their house every single day to check up on them. In that situation, we can have a person at home, to go back to the earlier question, at a cheaper cost to taxpayers, while still keeping everyone safe, and their liberty is not deprived in the sense of being in jail, where they're likely to learn from other criminals and come out worse off. That's a winning scenario, but all you see in the headline is person charged with carjacking released on bail.
It's interesting what you just said about, they go inside and become worse criminals. We spoke to somebody who had been back and forth inside for about 20, 21 years. And he said that there's a subgroup of people inside who are just like, it's a different society where people might come in for something that might not be a violent crime, but when they leave, they become like hardened criminals.
Right. It's a little crime school, they like to call it.
Mm-hmm. In the past, you've said that bail reform already exists. How so?
So here's the easiest example. So part of the new bill C-48, the bail reform package from the federal government, one thing they want to do is have the person has to be detained unless they can show why they should be released if they're alleged to have committed a gun crime while they're on a previous bail saying don't possess any guns, right? Which seems pretty logical and fair. The problem is we already have that law. The law is right now that if you're on a bail and you're alleged to have breached that bail, then you have to show why you should be released or you will be detained presumptively. So it's a duplication of the existing law. It has a 100% chance of being found unconstitutional when it's made law. just a big waste of everyone's time.
Well, I don't know if this question is going to go into what you just said, but we have a question for Gorbine Gurel, who says, "Hi, Professor Sewrattan. It would seem this reverse onus change runs contrary to Section 11E of the Charter. Do you foresee any constitutional challenges, and on what basis?"
Nailed it, right? There will definitely be a challenge to that one change. I think it's a slam dunk win. But the others are about gun offenses and domestic violence. And because there's such a slight change from the existing law, I think there will be challenges, but they are unlikely to be successful, which sounds good, but it also means that the law is not really changing to begin with. So you're not going to be safer tomorrow than you are today.
I don't know if people want to hear that.
It's the facts.
There's a huge story breaking today on social media and the news. A man in the GTA had his robbery charges, quote, tossed by a Newmarket judge last month because he had to wait almost 17 days in jail for his bail hearing. You were co-counsel on this case. What implications does this have on the bail system moving forward?
It has significant implications because following this case and others that preceded it, if the courts can't assess a person for bail within 24 hours of their arrest, then they're violating both the law, like the criminal code, and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And if that occurs, and if it continues to occur at the time of the person's trial, judges will increasingly start just tossing these charges, right? And so remember, these people are presumed innocent. They haven't been convicted of anything. But the public is going to lose the chance to have a trial on the merits to see if this person could have been convicted and then, of course, sentenced.
And I guess if you're a victim, that also has implications, no?
Huge implications. So the case that's in the news, which we did, there were two complainants who alleged that they were carjacked, right? And they're not going to get to see whether their allegation is going to be proven against my client. One thing to keep in mind, though, is there is a co-accused, like two guys were charged. The other co-accused wasn't part of this thing that I did. So he's having a trial. I think it actually starts today.
We spoke to Lee Chappelle, the gentleman I mentioned, who had been inside for about 21 years. And he's the president of Canadian Prison Consulting, Inc. And we talked about the work that he does with rehabilitating offenders. Is there a percentage of inmates who think that's possible to be rehabilitated?
I think there's certainly a percentage that think they're capable, but there's a higher percentage, fortunately, of inmates who are capable, right? Whether or not they realize it at the moment. People have to remember that if a 20-year-old kills someone and he's convicted of manslaughter, and we slam them with a 40-year sentence, they're still going to get out, right? They're going to be 60 and they're going to be back on the streets. And the idea is we want them to be better off when they get out than when they went in, because we as a community are going to be better off. The flip side of that is if we don't make them better off, then they're going to be the same or worse and do the same stuff again. So we believe in rehabilitation because we have to.
I just keep thinking of we spoke to someone who works with victims. We spoke to an offender. We also traveled to Thunder Bay, to Fort William First Nation, and we spoke to, they were doing a program around restorative justice. I'm going to ask you a question about that. And everybody that we spoke to was saying that this is complicated. Each case is different. Context matters. But I think for a lot of us, when you hear these horrible stories of people, being hurt, being victimized, friends, neighbors, people within our own families, or even us individually, emotion obviously is something that you can't tell people how to react in those situations, right? Grief and sorrow, those are all emotions that none of us want to experience. And if we lose a loved one in a violent act, they're taken away from us. But what I'm hearing from you is that we also have to take these cases individually. And I guess we also have to take a little bit of emotion away from that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You're completely correct. It's why the state is the body that administers criminal law in this country. The idea is we don't do retribution, right? We don't do an eye for an eye, because if we did that, things would just ratchet up. And part of not doing retribution is to turn the temperature down and try to take some emotions out of it. But of course, we still have to leave room for it because it's a very human and tragic process.
Well, recently, Paul Bernardo was moved from maximum security to medium security, and everyone was talking about that. And you saw politicians saying that if they were, the opposition, Pierre Poilievre was saying that if he, if he was prime minister, this is what he would do. You hear, and the emotions are so heightened because there's concern about politics getting involved with the criminal and justice system. Can you help us understand this case a little bit? For someone like Paul Bernardo, who's a serious offender, is there really a concern that he would be paroled?
No, there's looking at it dispassionately and someone who knows the system, there is zero chance that Paul Bernardo will ever be released from jail. He's going to die in jail.
Can you help us why that is? Because we hear, he's moved from maximum to medium, and we think,
Right. I teach criminal law at the law school in downtown Toronto. One of the first things the students learn is criminal law, like there's the law, but it's also a very human process, right? Paul Bernardo is public enemy number one. He did terrible things. And so regardless of what the law says, they're never letting him out. So that's that. In terms of the law itself, he's a dangerous offender, which is a rare thing that we label someone with. It means that they have an indeterminate sentence. They are supposed to be in jail for the rest of their lives, but there's always scope for them to get out. And that's the big boogeyman here, that one day he'll be able to convince a parole board to release him. But just consider what we're talking about, right? They change his classification and it's become national news for a period of weeks. Can you imagine if a parole board decided to release him, right? The whole board would be fired. So that's not legally correct, but it's what's going to happen.
We only have about a couple minutes left, and something that we see it on all the cop shows or all the documentaries dealing around justice. It's like, if you do the crime, you do the time. And when we were speaking to Lee, he was saying to me that maybe that needs to be reconsidered, because right now the idea is that if you do a certain crime, you go in for 5 years. You do this other crime, you go in for 10 to life. And he was saying, we live in a world where we have new crimes. I'm thinking of like online. People are being harassed online, and we're trying to figure out how to, enact that in our criminal code. And when we traveled to Thunder Bay, when we went to Fort William First Nation, we spoke to elders and experts, and they were talking about restorative justice, where the goal was to heal the offender. In your view, do you think that restorative justice can play a role in our criminal justice system?
Restorative justice can play a role, but it's going to have to be victim-led. Not in the sense that victims have been lazy or anything like that, but justice is just a word. It's discursive. It might as well replace it with like healing crystals, right? Because everyone has a different view of what justice does, and everyone has a different view about whether they consider that valid. So what does justice look like to a victim is the first question that should be asked. And then if justice looks like a restorative process where they're able to talk to the offender and, really kind of work through what happened and convey their emotions, then that's an avenue. For others, justice might look like to them throwing this person in jail for 2 to 5 years, in which case we have the perfect system built up for that.
And finally, you work in this space. You've been able to, I guess, see from both sides of the issue. What would you like for us to consider as members of the public when we talk about the criminal justice system?
Consider, like you said, that it's complicated. So the most overrepresented population in the prison system is Indigenous Canadians. And rhetorically, I asked, do you know who is the most likely victim of those kinds of crimes? Indigenous Canadians, right? The offenders are also the victims. So if you want to throw the book at offenders, you're also throwing the book at victims. And that's not just for Indigenous Canadians, it applies to across segments. So simple solutions are not going to work in such a complicated world.
So keep asking questions.
Keep asking questions.
Chris, really appreciate your time. Where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Sewrattan Law. I'm always tweeting about cases.
Really appreciate you helping us understand this, because it's so complicated. And I think there is a difference between feeling unsafe and actually being unsafe.
I agree.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. This is the last Thread Live for this season. Thank you so much for rocking with us for the past season, and we will see you next time. And thank you again to everybody on the support team, especially Carla Luqueta, the series producer. We'll see you next time.